Welcome to Elevating Consciousness, the podcast that brings you mind-expanding conversations into the heart of what matters most. I'm your host, Artem Zen, and our guest today is Natureza Gabriel, an ancestral neuroscience pioneer, the developer of Autonomics, and the founder of Hearth Science, an organization and community offering tools, trainings, and practices that help people cultivate nervous system fluency and deepen their experience of well-being. At the heart of his work is Autonomics, an animist cartography of living autonomic physiology. This framework has been shaped by over 3 decades of collaboration with more than 100 mentors and advisors across 25 healing traditions and 24 cultures, many indigenous. It is considered one of the first accurate maps of the living autonomic nervous system in modernity. His Autonomics trainings have been sought out by the United Nations, a division of NATO, global social and ecological movements, and elite firms in executive coaching and leadership development. He's the author of many books, including Restorative Practices of Well-Being, Finding Home in Your Nervous System, Autonomic Triage, and the Neurobiology of Connection. In this episode, we speak about Polyvagal Theory and its limitations, unpack Gabriel's autonomic model, explore how autonomic dysregulation creates diseases, touch on practices for rebalancing nervous system regulation, address the limitations of modernity, and carve out some potential pathways towards civilizational wellness. Enjoy. Natureza Gabriel, welcome to the show.
Artem, what's up? Good to see you.
Yeah, good to have you here. And I'd love to set some context before we begin. I first came across you when a member of an online community I'm a part of mentioned you as someone doing important work with the autonomic nervous system. And I also learned that you've been impacted by the work of Darsha Narvaz, who I've had on a previous episode of podcast. I know you had a chance to check that out. And I saw you had written quite a number of books, so I wasn't entirely sure where to begin. But when I saw you were releasing the Neurobiology of Connection, this book right here, it felt like something I definitely wanted to explore. And it's a phenomenal book. You're a very skilled writer. And I'm struck by the way you're able to communicate technical concepts in such a vivid, accessible, and poetic way. So I just wanted to appreciate you for that, because I find like, these kind of topics sometimes could get really kind of heady and lost, and they're hard to relate to. So I think we need more people that could articulate these kind of ideas in the way that you do. And I've also had the chance to watch some of the videos on the Restorative Practices portal, and there's so much there, and found it to be a really rich and comprehensive resource for better understanding well-being and nervous system, and just so many different pathways and levers that we could pull at and ways that we could intervene. So yeah, I've never seen anything quite like that. So I think that's just really amazing that you've put all that effort and time to convening this alliance and having all these practices in that portal. It's phenomenal. So with that said, I'd love to dive into your autonomics model and some of the core ideas in the Neurobiology of Connection. But maybe we can start with you sharing a bit about your background and some of the significant experiences that led you to the work that you're doing today.
Yeah, Tim, I'm honored to be here. Thank you for the kind introduction and your kind words about our work. I appreciate that. That means a lot to me. I've been working in this direction, I think, since I was 19 years old. I turned 50 this summer. So I've watched myself sort of in the evolution of this. I was studying neuroscience at Yale University, and this was in the early 90s. And I was very interested in it. And I also began meditating right around that same time. So I had a practice of meditation. I would sit on a cushion, and I was doing it daily. And I was having these experiences, and I had a really clear sense that something neurological was happening. And yet, none of the neuroscience that I was studying in school could meet it in any way, shape, or form. At that point in the early 90s, a lot of the neuroscientific work was very much focused on cognition. The neuroscience of emotion really hadn't begun to develop as a field. certainly the neuroscience of autonomic physiology was very localized to very specialist circles. If I had had the opportunity to study under Stephen Porges as an undergrad, for example, I might have encountered it earlier. But I wasn't aware of any of that work. And so I was having this sort of paradoxical disconnection between the interest that I had and then the experiences that I was having that I wanted to use the neuroscience as a lens to explore. And so I think that was the origin, in a way, of what has become 30 years of really my life's work. And I feel like if we sort of just distill it down, I'm really interested in what's driving human well-being and what's driving human ill-being. And it's hard for me not to look around at modernity and feel like it's kind of a dumpster fire. Like it's gone sideways in a lot of ways. And, without getting too heavy into the details of that, I look around and I see a lot of people who don't seem well or are happy. And I see a lot of problems at scale. We seem to be undermining the only biosphere in the known universe. Doesn't seem like a good idea. We don't seem very good at stopping. And, I'm very interested in why is that happening? And what is it within us, within our own, bodies, our own minds, that might be transformable, that can help us to experience more connection and relatedness to ourselves, one another, and nature, so that we behave differently, have different outcomes.
Yeah, beautiful. The whole notion, the limits of modernity is definitely a topic that's been on my mind more and more in these days. And this notion of the meta crisis, I think that's something I speak about a lot on this podcast. And my understanding is your new book, Ground, talks a lot about kind of modernity, and maybe we could touch on that later, because that's definitely an overlapping thread I think that we have. You also mentioned Stephen Porges, and I know you've worked with him, and that I believe he's been one of your mentors, and he's famous for Polyvagal Theory. And it's my understanding that you've also had some disagreements with his model, or felt that there was something that was missing. I'm curious if you could speak to Polyvagal Theory, its crucial insights, and what you felt needed to be added or expanded in that model of the nervous system.
So I encountered Stephen Porges' work, I think in 2010 initially. I was studying a modality called somatic experiencing. It was developed by Peter Levine, who your audience may be familiar with.
For sure.
It's like a naturalistic approach to the resolution of trauma. I was working at the time, I was coming out of working with young people who were incarcerated, and we were using mindfulness with this population. And we had sort of discovered this paradox in our work, which was that we thought of ourselves as a mindfulness organization, but what I think we were really doing was helping people to connect to themselves. And I think that what we were discovering, or at least what I was discovering, was that the mechanism of transformation wasn't actually sitting on a cushion. It was feeling safe enough to find contact with someone else in a circle. And so I was studying somatic experiencing, like many of the folks involved with that work in that organization at the time, to try to understand better this neurobiology of trauma and how we work with it more agentically and more skillfully. Because a lot of the things we were teaching in mindfulness to those kids weren't actually helpful, because their nervous systems were in really defended states. And I think this is something we should circle back to maybe later in the conversation.
For sure.
But I had gone to study with one of Peter's early faculty members, somebody who'd followed him around the world, was at the time a senior international instructor for somatic experiencing. And at that time, polyvagal theory was presented to the students of SE as sort of the theoretical underpinnings of how the model worked. So Peter and Steve had become, collegial, and I think their work was informing one another. They were in dialogue. And so we were being taught polyvagal theory, saying like, look, this is the sort of some of the neurobiological mechanisms that undergird why, this modality, somatic experiencing, is effective. And, sort of 15 years out from that, I can see that I got more interested in polyvagal theory than somatic experiencing. Not that I wasn't interested in somatic experiencing, but for me, polyvagal theory, when I encountered it, I think I understood it to some extent as a conceptual model. But what started happening pretty quickly was that being aware that there were three autonomic systems, and, particularly part of the innovation, and it's an enormous innovation of Stephen's work, is the recognition that there are actually two vagal systems. So when we talk about the autonomic nervous system, we're really talking about three neurological systems that are related and that are sort of comprehensively involved in the maintenance of the internal milieu of the body, and then our responses to safety, danger, and life threat. And, Steve was the first person to recognize that there's a differentiated vagal system. And that part of that system is responsible for social engagement, connection, attunement, relating. And part of it, in a certain set of conditions, is responsible for shutdown responses that are life threat responses. And I think for me, learning that system existed, it became a mirror in which I could look at some of my own experience in a very different way. Because I had a lot of experience with shutdown as a young person, didn't know what it was, couldn't describe it, couldn't explain it. Sometimes it's hard to describe the water you're in, right? You don't know what it is. And so for me, the most profound impacts of polyvagal theory initially were my own transformation as a result of being able to understand, this thing happened to me. It was the result of, shutdown from these traumatic events. These responses that I had were normal responses for someone having a shutdown. And part of that normalization alleviated this incredible burden of shame that I had experienced around what had happened. I think part of the beauty of that work and autonomics more broadly is as you begin to understand the body's biological responses to danger and life threat, it's easier to say, well, it's okay that my body did this. It was trying to take care of me. And I could then be compassionate towards myself and not so caught up in shame, which then created the possibility of me beginning to heal. So I think my first debt to Steve is really a personal debt. Thank you. You really helped me to transform my life, right? I was able to meet him a number of years later, and we started collaborating. And our team was basically given authorization to create the first sort of official public posters of his work. And part of the genesis of that project was that at this point I was out in the world. It was a decade later, around 2020. I was teaching this model. I was teaching polyvagal theory. I was teaching a polyvagal approach to mindful awareness. I had been teaching it internationally, and I kept having to describe the theory. And the theory is complex, and it's dense, and it's nuanced. And I kept making drawings. I have a cartographic instinct. I like to draw things. I want people to be able to see what's happening. And I think Steve liked the way that we were thinking about it, and he gave our team permission to do this poster. And, I kind of joke. I told him we could do it in 3 weeks. And, it's probably one of the more arrogant things I've said. It ended up taking us 9 months, went through 21 versions. It was very hard, actually, to do it well. But at the end of 2020, we released this poster. And, the Polyvagal Institute has it now. We've given that intellectual property back to them. So you may be able to, people might be able to find it there. As we completed that poster, something that I did was I built a software platform. You made a reference to it earlier. It's called the Autonomic Compass. And I built this platform where the front end was a diagnostic framework that was basically polyvagally informed. And so we took this sort of mapping of these different states. We're talking about states. These are energy processing templates for experience, basically. And we can go into what does it mean? What is an autonomic state? But essentially, the body sort of moment to moment, based on internal and external conditions, it's surfacing energy templates. And I think of them almost like presets on a graphic equalizer. If you have a fancy stereo, you can be set it for stadium, or Set it for intimate jazz club. These are like tuning presets, basically, on the nervous system. And they govern all of these different facets of our experience. So they govern the visceral state in the body, how fast the heart's beating, how's the breath working, like what's the capillary dilation of surface skin capillaries. Like they govern visceral state, muscle tension. They govern all of this kind of visceral stuff. They govern the kind of range of emotions we can access. They govern sort of the range of thinking we can access. They govern the way that we perceive a situation. And then they kind of channel the possible behaviors that could arrive from it. So I sometimes say, like, an autonomic state, it's kind of like a pair of neurological glasses that's hard to take off. And most people don't even notice that they're looking through them. They don't realize it's a thing, It's sort of like a neurological preset. Anyway, so there was, we had like 7 of these in this model. And what happened pretty quickly was that we started to see, we were working with clients all over the world, we started to see people arriving in states that were not on that map. So it was never my intent to challenge polyvagal theory. That was not the intent. I was, collaborating with Steve. I was, in awe and admiration of the work. But then we started using it clinically. And I started seeing places where it wasn't adequate to describe experiences people were having. And I started, noticing experiences myself that wasn't quite adequate. So at one level, it was really the result of a clinical sort of inquiry that we were doing. I think at another level, I could say there's also a really different methodology at play, which is to say that I've spent the last 30 years training in interoception and tracking. And so I have this, skill set that I've developed around tracking neurology in vivo in real time. And I started to be able to detect in myself and in clients that we were working with neurology that was not on the Porgesian map. And, early on, I was like, well, that can't be right because it's not on the map. But then when you start to realize how siloed this understanding is, so part of what happened when I was studying, the neuroanatomy for the poster was that I was comparing all of these neuroanatomical treatises and indexes and atlases. And you start to realize that the depictions of this neurology that are generally accessible are really inaccurate. Like if you go and Google the vagus nerve and you look at what it's telling you it is, that's about as close to the vagus nerve as, an oak tree in winter that you cut all the fine limbs off, just leaving the trunk and a couple of branches, is to like an oak tree in summer that's, tiny ramifications, tiny branches everywhere. Like they're not even closely related. And so the second thing was methodology. Like we were just inquiring into the systems in a different way. And there's a problem in neuroscience, and it's a problem that's fundamental, which is that we don't make the distinction typically between anatomy and physiology. So you can know where neurology is, but it doesn't mean you know what it does. And it doesn't mean you know how it functions in vivo, right? You can know where all the subway stations are in the New York City subway system, but until you understand how trains are moving, you don't understand how information is moving in that system. And so methodologically, we began to challenge a lot of the traditional neuroscience based on clinical experience we were having and this kind of interoceptive tracking that we were doing. And as I got further and further down this road, the thing that became more and more apparent is that there were fundamental flaws in the neurological maps that Steve inherited. And, I'd be happy to discuss this with anyone in the world because it's really important, right? We've mismapped these systems in a really fundamental way. And we've also been under the sway of a very brain-centric view in neuroscience for a very long time because the origins of neuroscience in, you could say Santiago Ramon y Cajals, who's sort of considered the father of neuroscience, if you will. This is the 1880s. It's in Spain. He's part of this European scientific tradition. They're living in a Cartesian paradigm. I think, therefore I am. This is the water they're swimming in. And so when they start looking at neurology, they're looking at the neurology affiliated with the structures they locate identity in. And if you think that your thinking is the center of things, you look at the organs where that takes place, which is in the brain, the cranial brain, right? the reality of the beauty of the autonomic nervous system is that the entire body is subtended by this architecture. And so when you start looking at the whole body and you look at the neuroembryological development of these systems and the way that they're instantiated in the body, you start to get a totally different view of what the fundamental neurology is. And this is what happened in our work, was that these sort of three things came together. And at a certain point, it was like, okay, we either need to update polyvagal theory or we need to differentiate. And it just wasn't possible to do the first. And so we did the second. And at that point, we sort of, differentiated our work from polyvagal theory, which was not without its challenges. And then here we are. We released this new foundation model in June of 2024. We validated it using an autonomic diagnostic technology that's novel, that uses breath and not heart rate variability as the primary signal. And I'll stand on that work.
Yeah, there's a lot of fascinating things there that you said that we could kind of unpack. I mean, I think the fact that you were noticing that people were coming in and doing this kind of work with you, and that there was other states that weren't mapped. So I guess I'm really curious about my understanding. I think you have 13 states now in your autonomic model, right? And there was 7. So what were the initial 7, and what were the additional 6 states that you put on top of that?
All right, this is going to be fun to see if I can do this. So
yeah.
When I first encountered polyvagal theory, I was aware that Steve had delineated a state that he called, social engagement, basically, like a connection state, right? Like you and I having this conversation, we're kind of like drinking our beverages, we're chatting, we're kind of leaned in, we're watching each other, we're listening to each other. So there's sort of this, social engagement state. This is a health creating state, by the way. I think that's important to say.
For sure.
Then I thought, okay, well, then you have the fight or flight responses. In traditional neurology, these are called, these are responses that are undergirded by the sympathetic nervous system. And then what Steve had identified was this shutdown state, right? That was a life threat state. And so when I came to him, and I had studied his work extensively, I thought those were the states. And he said, well, actually, in addition to those, there are several hybrid states. I said, well, what's a hybrid state? And he goes, well, hybrid is when there's more than one system working together. Mm. And so he said, for example, well, let's take play. If you're playing, there's some level of activation, which he would say is sympathetic. And then there's a level of connection, right? If we're dancing or, doing something playful, right? So he said that's a hybrid of those two. And so then he proceeded to add 3 hybrid states. So he added a state that he calls play, a state he calls intimacy, which is, I think people might think of sexual intimacy, which is, could be, but also like a meditative state where it's stillness, but it's connection, And then I believe he was aware of tonic immobility, which is also called freeze. I think that was on the original model. We'll have to double check. So he said, okay, there are also these hybrid states, and he added those 3. So that made 7 at the time. The things that I was seeing that are beyond that domain, that comprise the 13 that you asked for, are variations of appease. And appeasing, I would say, from an autonomics perspective, is the use of sociality when our underlying physiology is under threat. So we use sociality to get safer. Mm-hmm. And we see several variants of that. One of them that we call appease is when there's a fight or flight response. That's the primary defensive layer, but then a person is social, to get safer, right? The other one I would call placating. And, some of these have other names, like placating sometimes gets called fawning. That seems infantilizing to me, that, just as a term. Think a lot about the language of these, right? Because I think that's important because, it seems somewhat disrespectful to this state. right? Like, oh, that's something that like a baby would do or something, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's really important for your audience, to understand that all of these states are really important. There's no such thing as a bad state. This is, I think, a real misconception in terms of how the work is being translated. Like, oh, these are good states, these are bad states, these are, if you get stuck in a defensive state and it doesn't resolve and you can't shift it, or it becomes a habit, or you can't clear the stress load affiliated with it, yeah, that's not great. But all of these are adaptive responses that allow us to survive difficult situations. And we want the whole menu available, I think. That's important, right? So we saw appease, we saw placate. Those both, kind of add additional elements on the defensive side. And then we saw additional elements on the connection side. So I see a state of compete, which is, higher energy than play.
Mm-hmm.
I see a state that I think of as being a restoration state that's a little bit higher energy than like meditation, but is still a resting state. It has connection online. I'm gonna pull up the mandala here. I'm looking for it in the book, and maybe we can add it in post production so that people who are watching this can see that. I just want to make sure I'm telling you, accurately what's on the map.
Yeah.
We added another state, kind of just an energy click down from connection called enjoyment. I'm differentiating kind of arousal states or center of gravity and arousal on the connection side. We added a state of accommodation before appease. And that sort of, completes the map. So that's 13 states. But I think what I also want to say to your audience is the number is not that important,
Yeah.
The thing is that everybody's system is a little different. And when I teach this, I teach it as a color theoretical model. And I teach it like color theory because there are basically three variables that come together to create the energy processing template of a state. And, we can walk through those, but a color in a lot of color theory models is defined by three variables: hue, value, and chroma. And when you combine them, you get a very nuanced thing, right? You get so there are, 1,000 different blues defined. I mean, there's a million, there's an infinite number gradated based on these three variables. And the same thing is true autonomically, right? And this is also important. Somebody can have a shutdown response that's extreme in response to a life threat and they pass out. That would be one end of the continuum. They could also have a very, very mild shutdown response. I had one when I was playing tennis yesterday. I got to set point against someone who's a really elite player, and I sort of choked. And it was it was not subtle in terms of its effects, but it was subtle neurologically. Tiny bit of endogenous opioid release. I felt a tiny bit spaced out. I shanked 3 shots in a row. Big effect, but like very subtle shift neurologically, but it was a shift, And so with most of these states, there's a continuum that they operate on. And that continuum, it's governed by previous experiences we've had. It's governed by all of this historical architecture in our own systems, et cetera, how we're interpreting something, et cetera. But that's why I say, so we put 13 on the map to give people a sense of its fullness, but it's not exhaustive.
Yeah. Yeah. The way I'm getting that is there's a granularity, right? And you have the 7 states that Stephen's kind of mapped, and then you're making it more granular. Potentially it could be even more granular. We see this with emotions too. You have kind of the basic emotions like fear, sadness, anger, joy. And then, obviously we could expand on that and get more granular and more fine tuned and really feel into the nuance. So yeah, I think it's beautiful what you're doing with expanding that. And my understanding, right?
Or Tim, sorry, can I make just a quick comment on that? Because I think what you're saying is, I agree with what you're saying. I think of it like this: if you're, a little kid and you're learning to draw, they're going to start out. They give you 3 crayons. They give you blue, yellow, and red. They give you the primary colors, right?
Yeah.
And in this model, blue, yellow, and red is basically the first level of differentiation for somebody, just if they're trying to learn this for themselves, is, do I feel safe enough to connect? Do I feel in danger, or do I feel in life threat? That's like blue, safety; yellow, danger; red, life threat. Those are the first 3 crayons we hand somebody. We let them fuck around with those crayons for a while before we go to 13,
Yeah.
And then you can go to 13 crayons. And then suddenly you have 5 blues, and you have, orange and yellow, and you have different greens, you have different blues, right? And you can spend a lot of time with 13. But then at some point, maybe it's refined and you want that box of 64 crayons or 128, It's like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, beautiful. I love how you integrate color theory into it as well. And so, the 2 systems of sympathetic and parasympathetic that's like the sympathetic is a movement and parasympathetic is grounding, but then you're also bringing in connection, which is like the 3rd system. And you mentioned that there could be multiple systems online. So for example, if you're playing tennis, you probably have the movement system online, but you might also have the connection system online, right? You're enjoying it. You're in a flow state. You're connecting with somebody else. Whereas, if you're in a threat situation, like a bear is chasing you, you're in a movement system, but there's no connection. That system is not being activated there.
100%.
Yeah. Beautiful. Okay. And then, so I think there's also, so that's neurology, right? Which systems are activated. And neuroception, you mentioned neuroception, that's how safe or threatened the body feels.
Yes.
And then we also have neurochemistry, which is like which hormones or chemicals are at play, like adrenaline, cortisol, oxytocin, opioids, those kind of things.
Yes.
And your work is tracking all of those aspects of neuroception, neurology, neurochemistry.
Yeah, I almost, I see it as more of a recipe than an algorithm, but I do think there's sort of an intrinsic organization to it. And I think of them in order because of the order of determination. So the first in the sequence is neuroception, because neuroception, you can also think of it like, 2 ways to think of it. You think of it as like an autonomic temperature taking that your body's doing on a situation. Kind of taking the temperature of a room, you're taking the temperature of a situation. And, I also think about it sometimes. I've used this analogy of the snail, because like, a snail can either come out and it's vulnerable, or it can kind of retreat. It can't get hurt, but it can't really live. And neuroception is kind of like that gate, of this, neuroception in that analogy would be the kind of, ring where the snail can either, come out and live, but is more vulnerable because it's exposed, or can pull back and is less exposed, but can less live. Right?
Yeah.
So neuroception, the first, is the body safe enough? Does it feel in danger? Is it under life threat? That determination, and it's not our ordinary sense of self, Artem, that's making that determination. I think this is very important for people to understand. Like, I could have a thought that a situation's perfectly safe, but, something could happen that triggers this assessment, a smell that's off, or, a weird look someone gives me, or like energy I pick up on, who knows, right? Could be anything, right? That sets the body. It's not the mind. It's not cognition that's making this discernment. It's this embodied system. And it's really nuanced in its detection. And it's getting, it's getting a million times the information that cognition is, if not more. Sure. Orders of magnitude, right? Have you ever had that happen where you're like telling yourself, like, there's something making me nervous. I don't even know what it is about a situation.
Absolutely.
Right? That's neuroception. That's this detection. And so that governs the neurology and the neurochemistry. And another, just interesting detail is that when these things update, the mechanism is through the breath. So autonomic updates will happen on the next breath cycle after a detection. Sometimes, you get really scared and you stop breathing for a second, and then on the next breath, the heart rate shoots up or something. Autonomic updates happen through the cycling of the breath.
Yeah, so maybe we could talk a bit about like health and disease. I know you've been writing about this too. So what does a healthy autonomic nervous system look like? You mentioned that, you know, it's not every state, there's no like good or bad states. The problem is when it gets stuck, right? The rigidity, you get stuck, you can't move out of it. So there's probably, from my understanding, a healthy nervous system and one that's fluid, when there's fluency, to be able to move through the states and not get stuck in them. Is that correct? How would you describe a healthy autonomic nervous system?
Yeah, that's a good question. So what is health autonomically? What is, the lack of it? So I would say I think it's, a few things. And I agree with what you said. Part of it is response flexibility. That you're responding to the situation in real time, it's fluid, that you have access to this map. Some people don't have access. I mean, a lot of people don't have access to the full map. And it's impossible to talk about this stuff in a real way without us addressing the way that these systems get shaped in early childhood. So I had the good fortune to be able to interview and be in dialogue with Dr. Vincent Folletti for a period of time. He was a primary mentor to Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, who was one of my collaborators a decade ago. And, Folletti is the co-principal investigator of it's the ACEs study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences study.
Okay, yep.
It's the largest epidemiological study of trauma that's ever been done. And, one of the outcomes of that study was that they discovered there's a graded dose-response relationship between early adversity and adverse health outcomes. So in plain language, the more exposure you have to early adversity, the worse your health is going to be as an adult. And it's a very important study because, among other things, where it's been operationalized, it allows people to intervene earlier. But one of the things the study means is that early traumas, we say time heals all wounds. Well, it's not true. It's not true of autonomic wounds, Time doesn't actually change those. And over duration, because in that study, the average age of respondents in the ACEs study was 57 years old. He was doing these health questionnaires with adult patients of Kaiser Permanente in Southern California. But they were talking about things that happened when they were like 7 years old, 50 years ago. And so part of the take home from that is that early experiences of adversity, unless they're addressed, unless there's active intervention, they cascade forward and they impact upon health for the rest of a person's lifetime. Nadine Burke-Harris, Dr. Burke-Harris, has done really incredible work in California to get funding, to get, diagnostic and early intervention done so that, because we can identify these things pretty early. If we can intervene more proactively, then we can transform these outcomes. It's a very powerful lever of public health. But one of the things that Folletti didn't explore, and didn't have sort of the purview necessarily, or even the diagnostic technology to do it because of the way they did this study, was, well, when an adverse experience happens, what is the specific defensive response the child goes into? Because one of the things we say in trauma healing is it's in the nervous system, not the event. You and I could be standing next to each other and have the same experience. Like, we're going to go out and give a TED Talk together. And I could be like, oh my God, like I'm totally overwhelmed. And you could be like, I'm so excited, right? I can't wait. I've always wanted to do this. And so, people can have an experience, and based on their history, their interpretation, all these factors, it can land in the nervous system in a different way. So, one kid in a family watches their parents fighting and is like, my dad's an asshole and I don't want to have anything to do with them. And, goes into like a fight response. A younger child watches it, gets totally overwhelmed, totally freaked out, and shuts down. Right? You can have one event that has differential autonomic impacts depending on, the nervous system of the person witnessing it. So I'm very interested in, what are the specific nervous system states a person goes into in something like this? And then how do we remediate those in a very targeted fashion? The reason I'm bringing this up is because, if we're looking at health now, we have to look at how much allostatic load, it's like a fancy medical word for trauma, has been accumulated. How much stress is the system carrying anyway? And I do clinical work, and I'll work with people who are, in their 50s and 60s and 70s sometimes. And often we're responding to a present moment illness or situation that's triggered by a pre-existing autonomic condition from childhood.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like there's so much gold here to mine in terms of understanding how trauma relates to the nervous system and like being stuck in a state. And like, if there was a way to measure like anybody's body, like coming into like, say, a certain device, and you're able to measure the body and kind of see like, look, this is what's happening in the body. And there's actually stress that's being carried out from 20 years ago, 30 years ago, whenever it was, that's still here in the body. And to be able to resolve it, that would be fantastic. And I think you mentioned that we don't actually have necessarily, like in mainstream medicine, we don't really have a way to measure this stress load. So like, is there any way that we can, obviously, I think when I think about interacting with certain people, like some people you interact with, and you could just feel how stressed out they are. Like I used to personal train clients. So like, you get to know them, you work out, you see what their lifestyle is like, kind of how they're eating, different things. And some people you just see they have so much stress in their life that's impacting their health, and you could kind of feel it. But if there was a way that we could actually measure in a similar way where I just did a test where I was like measuring myotoxins and things like that, like just giving a urine test and seeing all that. But if there was a way to actually see like, look, this is what's happening in your nervous system, like having a report, like this is what's happening in your nervous system. And like, this is how it's impacting your health. Like, I think that if we had a better way to get at something like that, it would make it easier for people to understand and really, really connect them. Cause I think a lot of people are skeptical about still, even though like we're understanding trauma a lot more now. I think there's still like, I see so much articles and stuff. There's been a lot of stuff like kind of straw manning, the body keeps the score. Like that's a huge trauma book. And there's been a lot of people kind of pointing out limitations or things where he was wrong or ways that he went too far and stuff like that. And then they throw the baby out with the bathwater. It's like, oh, there's nothing there. And that feels like a straw man of what's being presented in that book and the study of trauma in general.
So the area that you're pointing to, I would call autonomic diagnostics. And so I run a neurotechnology company, and we have sort of an accelerator in the company. And so we're working on early stage neurotechnologies around some of this, particularly on the diagnostic side. If somebody wanted to do this today, most smartwatches have some kind of a heart rate variability monitor built into them. Or if they don't have it built in, there's an app that you can add to it, right? So heart rate variability is the patterned acceleration and deceleration of the heart in tandem with the breath. For your audience who might not be familiar with this, anytime you inhale, the heart rate accelerates. Anytime you exhale, it decelerates. This is why if people are, like, oh, relax, breathe out more. Like yoga techniques are based around this. Pranayamic techniques are based around this. This is something that's been understood by ancestral healing systems for a long time, right? You can basically use heart rate variability to reverse engineer which autonomic systems are active. Because the heart is governed by the sinoatrial node, it's the pacemaker. And the sinoatrial node is innervated, it has neural inputs from all three autonomic systems. The part of the problem with this technology as it currently exists is that, like earlier when you were talking about parasympathetic and sympathetic, most people who understand the autonomic nervous system, and I mean, this is even the way it's taught in medical school right now, they're taught it as like a seesaw, a balance of these two systems. But the parasympathetic system actually has these two branches. These two vagal branches. One of them is health creating, one of them is pathogenic, it's disease creating. And the problem with the HRV models isn't that the HRV measurement is wrong, it's that the autonomic model they're using to interpret the measurement is wrong. And so you're getting some compromise of the data. Like these things can't tell the difference between being excited and being nervous because the sympathetic outflows are the same. They can't tell the difference between the heart rate slowing down because you're healthy, because your connection system's online, and your heart rate being slowed down because you have accumulated cold stress from life threat responses. So it's not necessarily a super accurate reading, but for someone who's like not convinced that this shit's real, use an HRV app on your phone or on your watch and just check, because it'll index a level of stress. It won't necessarily be super accurate. It's probably in the ballpark. We've spent a fair amount of time, and I wrote a white paper about this recently. It's on ResearchGate.
I read that.
Yeah, looking at like why that signal was chosen. So the reason heart rate variability was chosen as an autonomic signal has a lot to do with the technological limitations on compute in the 1970s in psychophysiology. They didn't have the computational ability to use a continuous signal. It required too much computational power. But that's not true anymore. And the breath is a superior autonomic signal because of what the breath actually does autonomically, which is that it encodes the updates. And so we've worked with a team that's in India that's developed an autonomic diagnostic technology that uses respiration. And it's very sophisticated. It's much more nuanced. And so, clinically, like we can see this stuff diagnostically. I can also, anecdotally, I mean, you were talking about just the intuition of like, you're around someone enough, you realize they're carrying a baseline stress level, right? And I think of that as being autonomic composition, which is like you get up in the morning and what are you carrying with you from before, Because all of these experiences, they accumulate, experiences of stress accumulate if we don't have ways of metabolizing them, clearing them out of the system, transforming them, exiting them. And a lot of these modalities that have emerged, trauma healing modalities of various kinds, EMDR. There's David Berceli's work on the trauma release process. A lot of these are sort of looking at ways to mechanically or neurologically induce exiting some of those allostatic loads. Somatic experiencing is a technology that can help people exit those allostatic loads. We do that work ourselves. We do it a little bit differently because of our understanding of the autonomic nervous system being different, right? But those loads tend to be neurology and chemistry that the body has retained, and the body can retain these things indefinitely.
Yeah, something I've been trying to incorporate more into my life is this notion of emotional processing, and I think that touches on that too. Is the fact that as we're living our lives, stress, things are happening, and we don't necessarily always have time, and we kind of just hold that. But if we don't make time to do the kind of work to move that energy, that gets stuck. So there's a clinical psychologist, Douglas Tatter, and he has this. He created, it's called the biomotor framework, and it's like a way of working with the emotions. And he kind of found the 9 core feelings that people have. He worked at it as a statistician, so he was very intricate with mapping these kind of things. And I found that to be like a really useful framework of like understanding emotions, and also being able, he has a process of like where we feel these emotions, where we're able to like kind of differentiate and feel them and feel what's happening in the body, and then connect it to cognition as well and be able to process. So there's a lot of, like you said, there's a lot of different modalities, but yeah, it's just the fact that people taking the time and actually engaging with these modalities to be able to kind of clear that emotional load and that stress load that builds up in the body.
Well, and I think, Artem, it's a beautiful maybe segue to thinking about practice a little bit, right? And the practical side of it, because even at a very simple level, I noticed this today. Like I was excited and also like a bit nervous to be having this conversation with you. And if I can, I had to take a moment this morning to just kind of get quiet and sit and interocept, feel myself inwardly, to check, like, where am I, in this moment? I'm having these feelings. I'm excited. I'm a little nervous. Like, what is it that's happening? How do I feel? And just taking a few minutes, even without a technique, not like it has to be technical, even just taking a minute to like sit, disconnect from the external world a little bit and just check in. That shifted the trajectory of my morning. Because when I checked in, I was like, I had been planning to do this from my office. And then I felt, no, I actually want to do it from the forest. And so just that moment of dropping in, and I'm glad to do it out here with you. But I wouldn't have made that choice if I hadn't felt myself for a minute,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm glad you did it here too. I've been just really enjoying the background, and also I've been hearing I've been hearing roosters.
Yeah, there is one. I'm glad it's not filtering them out.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, and it's amazing. Like, I actually, for every interview, I always have like an interview prepared, and then I just kind of follow where it goes. But it's been so interesting because it's like whatever the next question I have, like, you just start organically speaking on it. And like this, I wanted to actually go to practices next, and specifically practices for rebalancing the nervous system. And, I wanted to look at some common examples of imbalances in the nervous system. And, you tell me if there's other ways of mapping it, but there's kind of the two that I had. And there's one that's like the anxious, and maybe this maps with like attachment styles, like the anxious person, and then somebody who's very avoidant. So, like maybe we could start with like the anxious. Let's look at first at somebody who has very high levels of anxiety. They constantly feel overstimulated, like their nervous system is in overdrive and high alert. What's a particular pathway, perhaps different levers to pull at, or practices this person can start to engage with in order to rebalance this kind of hyperactivation in the nervous system?
I like this word levers.
Yeah, me too.
You've used it a couple of times, and it's a word I use as well. Because I think, when I was describing earlier, I think I described sort of like five layers of experience that are governed by the ANS. I'll just say them again. So visceral state, emotion, thinking, perception, behavior. I think of the autonomic nervous system as being like the geological layer of the nervous system. Like, it's very deep, it's like bedrock. It's very deep. And then a lot of these other processes happen on top of that,
Yeah.
So there's a sixth layer that I think is sort of an emergent property of this, which is that we tend to identify with the autonomic states that we spend the most time in. For better or worse, either health creating or disease creating, health creating or pathogenic, right? So when I look at anxiety through the lens of autonomics, to me, it's a flight response that doesn't get to complete motorically. Okay, so what do I mean? It's a flight response. So it's a response to danger where the body wants to get away. But for me, the definition of anxiety is that we lose contact with the ground, and therefore the body doesn't get to execute the motor movement of escape. So one of the simplest and most profound antidotes to anxiety that I've ever experienced and come across in the world is barefoot shoes. And it's, I doubt your audience was expecting me to say that. I don't know. Maybe they were. They're like, he's going to say barefoot shoes. Yeah. But the reason is I think profound, which is that if you're wearing barefoot shoes, it's harder to lose proprioceptive contact with the ground. And the way that anxiety tends to accelerate for people is they lose contact with the ground. They lose contact. I mean, I'm talking about in the present moment at an embodied level. They lose feeling the ground. Then they lose contact with the pelvic floor, because that's the sort of body's ground up from the legs in the torso. If you lose contact with the pelvic floor, then they lose contact with the core. And then all of a sudden the breath is no longer going down into the belly, down into the ground, but is like trapped at the respiratory diaphragm, and people are breathing just up here. And then it gets faster and faster and more dysregulated, and people kind of, their energy is like going up. You know, it's no longer dropped, right? So again, so it's also an autonomic habit, you know? And I think it's also one of these things where it can be learned really early, right? So I'm not talking about the psychology of it at all.
For sure.
I'm just talking about the physiological response, right? So one of the things that, you know, if that's a response that's coming up for somebody, that we'll invite them to do is like practice successfully escaping. You know, I mean, I've been in meetings where like, well, I don't want to, I want to use an example that's current for me. So I was telling you, I was playing tennis yesterday. I got to this point where I had a set point on this person, and I got a little overwhelmed, and then my body like shifted slightly into anxiety. And then I just sort of wanted to get away from the court, you know? And it's like, if I had a little more presence, because I couldn't quite reset, I then lost the next 4 games in a row. But if I had been a little more present and detected what had happened, I would have maybe let my body do an escape, like walk off the court for a minute, let myself succeed in giving the body the chance to do what it wants to do. You know, I've had a meeting, let's say you're in a meeting and like something starts to make you anxious. You don't even know what it is. My advice to people is like, find an excuse to leave. You know, most of us carry cell phones, so you can be like, oh, I got to take this call from my, you know, my dog needs to be picked up from that, whatever. You say whatever you have to come out your mouth face to be able to like leave the meeting without people thinking you're an asshole. But then you let yourself leave. You feel the contact feel the contact with the ground as you're successfully escaping. Go to the restroom or whatever, and then just take a minute to be with yourself and to breathe. Usually the thing that made you anxious is a valid, you know, like there's a valid neurological or safety reason that happened. And often having a little space away from the situation, you'll be like, you know what? I don't know what I can say on your podcast, but that motherfucker was looking at me in a weird way. I did not like the way that felt. That made me nervous. You know? You'll identify with there a little bit of space when the pressure's off, what the thing was that made you feel that way. And then it's kind of a different ballgame, because you're like, well, I could either choose to go back, but when I go back in, I'm going to fucking make eyes at that person for a minute to let them know I felt that. You know, you get to re-script it, you know? Or you go, I'm not going back to that meeting. I didn't like that. I didn't like the way that person behaved. I don't want to be with those, you know, whatever it is, right? And again, I mean, I'm speaking in a way that presumes a certain amount of privilege in the situation or autonomy.
Yeah.
You know, I'll take responsibility for that. But the principle applies. And it comes from this kind of close tracking of the experience. And like, I think it's helpful to teach people to let the body do something or respond, even if cognitively we don't know why it's doing that. Because often the tangle is that someone in their head is like going, well, Gabriel, like, you're not in danger in this meeting. Like, this is an important meeting. You should be here. Like, why would you want to leave? Like, you get into this fight with yourself, and then all of a sudden the thing spirals.
Yeah. You know, the thing that you're saying too that stands out for me is the fact that your awareness, when you start feeling anxious, it starts kind of moving up, and then you kind of go into your head and you go into like the story about it, whatever the thing is making you anxious, and you lose contact with the body.
Right.
So I love how you're saying to start with the feet, like barefoot shoes, just really feeling the ground and just being, it seems like that's, you know, because you could leave the meeting, right? You could leave the meeting and then just start ruminating about what's happening in your head. So there's that critical fact of bringing the awareness to the body and learning how to stay with the sensations in the body. Because I think also Douglas Saturn would talk about this, like, actually anxiety is basically not feeling your emotions. Like, if you don't feel your body and you don't feel your emotions, that's where you have this experience of like this erratic state. But really, if you just feel what's happening in the sensations, There might be some fear, there might be some sadness, there might be some anger, but there won't be this kind of overblown thing where it becomes a story.
I think that's very interesting, and it's important to recognize that we can have a flight response to an internal state we're having. If I'm having an emotion and I don't want to feel it and I'm trying to escape it, that's like a flight response I'm having to something that's happening inside of me.
Yeah.
So I think, it lines up for me, these layers of awareness sort of working against each other, right?
Yeah. So perhaps we could look at the other kind of archetype, like the avoidant or numb. Let's say somebody has like this avoidant type of disposition, somebody who doesn't know what they're feeling, or, if you ask them how they're feeling at any given moment, it's probably fine. That's like a favorite. Fine, good. Perhaps they live a lot in their heads. There's a lot of strong intellectualizing and rationalizing defenses. What are some practices you would recommend to somebody with this kind of disposition as a way to perhaps start reactivating and sensitizing the nervous system and kind of like feeling the nuance, feeling what's there beyond fine?
Well, I guess I want to start out by saying I'm not expert in attachment theory and I'm not a therapist.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, I'm not really qualified to speak about it at all through those lenses. But as you're describing the attributes of the behavior, it registers for me as being in the domain of shutdown.
Yeah.
Again, just looking at the neurophysiology, if a person says, I feel, how are you doing? Fine. Like not a lot, don't have a lot of contact interoceptively. One of the hallmarks of shutdown responses is deficits in interoception. In plain language, if we have a lot of shutdown, we don't feel ourselves. We don't feel the body. I'll just speak to my own experience again. Like this was my experience when I was really little. Grew up in a forest, in a village, in a community, very connected. Got ripped out of it when I was 7 years old and just kind of went up into my head.
Yeah.
And then, I look at my own healing trajectory. Well, what was required to heal that? Well, I had to feel, eventually, it took me 40 years or something. I had to feel the grief. I had to feel the loss. I had to feel all the things that I, at 7 years old, was like, there's no way I'm going to feel that because that's all radioactive with loss. If I felt that at 7 years old, I felt like I would have died. I would have drowned in it. It was too big. It was like too much loss. So it took me a very long time to be able to reapproach it. But the reclamation of embodiedness, it's not really a word, but that process was to be able to feel the stuff that I hadn't been willing to feel. And for me, this place, I'm in this forest, and I had grown up in a forest, and there was this moment. It's a funny story, but there was this moment when, we during the pandemic, we had been filming a series and we had lost access to the place where we were filming it, and we needed a film studio. And anyway, I discovered this property, this place. I fell in love with it. We ended up leasing it. And then there was this moment several years later when we bought the property. And I remember the moment that we signed, that the offer was accepted by this seller. Because my real estate agent, she called me and I was standing out here in the forest. And literally the moment that she said the offer had been accepted, there was this thing that happened in my chest. It sounded like a drumstick, or no, like a wishbone in a turkey breaking. This thing cracked in my heart. I could hear it. It was audible. It was loud enough. I said to the real estate agent, I go, BG, did you hear that? She goes, what are you talking about? But it was like this, it was like something breaking and resetting. And it was, for me, like that was the moment that I healed, from this traumatic loss of the forest at 7 years old. Right? So 47 years later, or 40 years later, right? This moment of like the thing. So I couldn't heal it at the time. I couldn't heal it when I was 7 or 17 or 27, or, it was too big. The loss was too catastrophic. Right? So I think, there's some things we just don't have the capacity or the space to feel. And that's just real. Certain losses, right? That, maybe if I'd been able to grieve it in community. I think community is sort of like a secret sauce here, because some things we can't heal by ourselves or even in a dyad, we could heal in a circle, right? And again, I think this starts to get at what's happening in modernity, which is this accumulation of these harms and these losses and these griefs and this alienation that's become very normalized, even though it's not species normal. And this is where our work really comes into harmony with Darsha's work, looking at this deep lineage of our evolutionary history in small band hunter-gatherers that were really oriented towards safety and connection in this communality. And that's really the Aboriginal context in which our nervous systems were designed to thrive.
Yeah, I mean, this resonates with me. I feel like when you say the word community, to me, that's becoming more and more of like a central word for me of like what I want to do. Like I've been spending a lot of time and energy in creating this podcast, and I love this and I love these kind of conversations, but I'm feeling this kind of drive, like how do I do more community-based sessions? How do I get more people on the call? How do I get more perspectives? How do we kind of tap into this collective intelligence? And yeah, it's I find a lot of my community online, right? And I want more in-person type stuff. And it's just so much harder to find people that are kind of exploring similar things. I find like it's a lot easier online, but it feels like community is just, it's a central thing for me. And I think it's a central thing for people, whether they realize it or not. Like, I think a lot of, like you were mentioning, like grief, like a lot of times people feel like they should be able to go through grief themselves. And like, I felt that so much, like with my own grief, I'm like, oh, I wish I could just like collapse, like just have a circle of people and just to be able to kind of collapse with my grief into that circle and have people hold that space and but that's a hard thing to find. And that's, I think there's more spaces now like that, thankfully, but it's still like when we think about modernity still being this kind of dominant worldview, which is very much based on, the individual and individualism and being self-reliant and being, and especially I think for men also, right? Like for men, it's like, should be able to, like I should be able to deal with everything myself. Like I see that with friends around me all the time. And I see that like, there's still parts of me that are like that. Yeah. And yeah, it's just the community aspect is huge.
One of my friends, he's been trained in a healing lineage. It's an indigenous community, an indigenous tribe from present day Burkina Faso, more or less, West Africa. They're called the Dagara. And Malidoma Some is Dagara. He's one of the people who sort of brought some of their worldview and spiritual technologies to the West. His sister, his wife, I'll add her name to the show notes, but she brought one of the Dagara grief rituals as a spiritual technology, basically, to the West. And I had the good fortune to participate in one of these spaces, and it's really, it's sort of a sacred container that's designed to help bring support for the metabolizing of grief. And even though the container, I didn't think of it, was held with that much ritual skill. It's not like a first generation practitioner. It's not somebody who's from the tribe. It was, somebody who's a student of a student of a student kind of thing.
Yeah.
The technology of that coming together with that intent was really powerful and transformational, and really, helped me heal in something I didn't even have words for what needed to be healed, right? And I think if we look at, I'm very interested in this question of, what is healing and what are we healing from? And I think, a lot of this book Ground is about that question. What are we healing from? And I think so much of it is civilizational and cultural. And, you know, one of my, it's not an argument with the ACEs study, but a place where I think it could be expanded. You know, Folletti and the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, he was looking at these 10 categories of adverse experience, but they really apply at an individual level. You know, did you ever witness your mother getting hit? You know, did you grow up in a family where there was mental illness or somebody was incarcerated? You know, these are kind of like individual level things. But then I'm very curious, like, well, what about if you've ever been discriminated? What if you've ever, you know, been discriminated against because of your ethnicity, because of your religion, because of your, you know, gender, because of your sexuality? These like kind of social harms, right? And when I think about those harms, which also, you know, we can certainly have an autonomic response to that, right? Absolutely. But those are sort of like breakdowns in the village keeping us safe, you know? Those are social harms. And so we think about, you know, the context of an individual therapeutic engagement. And, you know, modern sort of European psychotherapy is very focused on healing at this individual level and from the familial context. Yeah. But then there's a whole sort of, you know, layer of it that's actually healing from the village not being able to keep us safe, you know? And then even deeper, I think, for modern people, the village not even having been there, because we're biologically hardwired to expect that there will be a village, because we have a primate, you know, social engagement system that's looking for 25 to 35 people, you know?
Yeah. I mean, you know, I guess we're now kind of leaning more into like the conversation about like modernity and the limitations of modernity. I know that's the topic of your upcoming book, The Ground. You know, maybe there's a lot of things that are kind of obvious about what's gone wrong, what's wrong in the world, how people are disconnected. But yeah, what do you see? What do you see are some, you know, potential pathways of creating a culture that's more conducive to well-being? You know, especially given the fact that we are living in this economic system. And I think that's another thing I've been thinking about, like what is post-capitalism, right? What can an economic system like that be? And I don't think it's an easy question. I think we're still grappling and trying to figure those things out. But yeah, just how can society be different? You know, we have kind of like these communities that we could kind of create that are off the grid, and we have these retreats and different, you know, people can have these kind of experiences that are restorative and healing. But if we look at how most of us live our lives, we are kind of embedded in modernity. We are embedded in capitalism. I see this in my own life. You know, it's like, it's not ideal. I don't know if it'll ever be ideal. I try to, you know, create certain rituals and certain spaces and certain practices that allow me to connect to what's important to me, to other people, to nature, to myself. But still kind of embedded in this, like, I see these aspects that, you know, and I'm trying to like, you know, really feel into the modern man in me that's there, right? That's still kind of like wants to be individualistic, wants to make fuck you money and sit in a castle, you know what I'm saying? And not have to worry about anything, not have to deal with these, not have to grapple with these questions of, you know, social inequality and oppression and just the horrible things that are happening in the world, right? Because to grapple with these things, there's so much discomfort there and dysregulation. And it's like when we're dealing with, you know, I'm dealing with my own stuff, you know, with my family stuff. And like, I have 2 little kids and I have my own stress. And then there's the societal stuff. And so I can see how it can be also overwhelming for people to try to think beyond modernity when we're so embedded in it. Just, I'd love for you to kind of just reflect on, you know, I was just kind of saying some of these things about the limits of modernity and how I feel it in my own life and in my own system. And I know that's the topic of your upcoming book, Ground. So yeah, I'm just curious to kind of hear your thoughts on the limitations of modernity and maybe like pathways of how we can move beyond it.
Well, so let's spend a few minutes complicating your question.
For sure. Let's do that. I love that.
I like your question. I think there's a lot there. And I feel, I want to tell some stories about some of the experiences I've had over the last few years. We've been on an interesting ride. So I have this book coming out in December. It's called Ground. The subtitle is How Modernity Disconnected from the Earth, Why It Matters, and How to Fix It. And it's the second book in this trilogy. So I've been, the big effort that I've been putting in, I write a lot. I was trained as a creative writing, I went to Stanford University creative writing program. I've trained with a lot of writers. I've had really good mentoring around writing, so I read a lot. But these 3 books are the ones that I'm putting, 100% into. We do handbooks, we do curriculum, stuff like that. But these
beautiful books, yeah.
Yeah, we're just going full on after it because I think this, the autonomic nervous system, it's so beautiful, it's so mysterious. I think, as you said earlier, often people get really lost in the technical realms of this stuff, but it's so human. It's so deeply human. And what I wanted to do was to write a book from the perspective of each of these autonomic systems. So the first book, I really sort of let my own connection system govern it. And it's interesting as a writing project because it's one of the few books I've written just from start to finish, like I was having a conversation with somebody. I've written books in spirals and sideways and backwards and everything, but this one, the Neurobiology of Connection, really came out in a linear fashion. And it seems sensible to me because it'd be like you and I just having a conversation, and it might loop back to something we talked about before, but it just sort of came like that. The book coming out now, Ground, I gave myself one rule when I was writing it, only one rule, which was that every time I sat down, I would take my shoes off.
Love that.
And I would just spend a few minutes just connecting. I have a friend named Chiokasin Ghost Horse. He's from the Cheyenne River, Lakota. He taught a seminar to a group of us, which was totally badass. I'm going to just say it's on our website, and I'm going to say to your audience, check his workout, TIOKASIN Ghost Horse, like it sounds. He's a genius. And I asked him to teach us Lakota because the old Lakota language is so extraordinary. He describes it as a non-mathematical, quantum mechanical language of intuition. That's how he explained it to me. And I go, teach a group of us Lakota. And he said, no, I don't think I want to do that. He said, but I'll teach you the place in consciousness from which it's spoken. And so, yeah, we have these recordings. He gave us 4, I don't know if you want to call them lectures or transmissions. I don't know what the fuck they were, but they were outrageously potent. Mm-hmm. One of the words he taught us is this word, anamahoptanye. And it means the earth is constantly uploading information through you. And he's like, why does everybody talk about getting a download? Why is nobody interested in getting an upload? And it messed me up a little bit, that question. I was like, why is that? And I'd had this experience. I had a really major decision to make in 2018. We had sort of hit this weird crisis with our work. It was unclear to me the next direction it would take. My wife and I were contemplating buying a new place. I was scared because it seemed like a lot of money. We live in California. Real estate is fucked up expensive here. And I was sitting with this executive coach I was working with, beautiful man, named Christopher Kunch. I was sitting with him in his backyard in Wildcat Canyon above El Cerrito, California. And we were just trying to kind of listen together for this next sense of direction. And I remember leaning forward and we were outside and my shoes were off. And I can't even remember exactly the moment that this happened, but all of a sudden my feet started talking to me. And Christopher, God bless him, had the wherewithal to notice something was happening and to ask me what was going on. And I was kind of sheepish about this because that was not within the realm of my model of how the world worked, that your feet would tell you something. But I said to him, I go, my feet are talking to me. And I think it's very important what happened, which is that he got curious about what they were saying. Because the other thing that could have happened, and that I think happens to a lot of children who have intuitions they don't really understand, is that, somebody who's influential is like, oh, feet don't do that. They don't talk to you. They're your feet, right? And if he had said that to me, I didn't have enough confidence. I think it would have just closed the door on it. But instead he was like, well, ask them, like, what are they saying to you? And then I proceeded to voice what they said, which was basically like, why are you asking your head how to get you where you want to go? Your head doesn't know anything about that. We're your feet. We're the ones that get you where you want to go. Ask us. And then we both started laughing because it was so like directly true. And then he asked my feet, well, do your feet want to do this house thing? And they were like, yeah. And he's like, well, I think you should probably listen to that. And it was like the first time that and then when Shiokasin told us this word years later, I was like, holy shit, I know what that means. Because I had that happen. So the only rule I gave myself was that I take my shoes off. And the book, came together very non-linearly. The book is very different than the first book. I've had people read it who read the first book and they're like, huh? And I'm all, well, it's a different system that's speaking. It's the grounding system. It's in the deep belly. It's not the social system. And it has this different kind of logic. But the thing that I got interested in was like, why don't modern people experience themselves as being rooted? The Lakota have a word for humans. The word is shante. And it basically, it means treeing being. Like the verb of a tree, but it's a word for humans. In the word is the implication of our rootedness. And so I got very curious, like, why aren't modern people rooted? And I got curious about it at a civilizational level first, I think. Because one of the things I noticed is if you ask somebody who grew up in the West, if you say to them, heaven and you just like fill in the blank, and then you ask somebody who grew up in a non-Christianized part of the East, heaven and, the person in the East says heaven and earth, and I fucking guarantee you that's not what the Westerners said in their own private mind. I guarantee you that's not the word. So how did the word they said get substituted for earth? What the fuck happened there? How did it go from heaven and earth to heaven and what people said in their minds? I was very interested in that because that didn't seem like an accident to me. That seems like imperial logic. Somebody's profiting from that transformation. And I got very interested in empire. So I had written this collection of essays basically called, so about that death cult you joined, which is this inquiry into empire and modernity. And it sort of initially started out looking at the Roman Empire and the way that imperial logic has contaminated and continued to infuse modernity. I don't really think we live in a democracy. I don't really think we ever have. I think it's an empire. I think it happens to be an economic empire. It's not, political in the same way, but it's certainly imperial. And I'm very curious about domination as a construct, because I think that if you dig deep enough, the roots of the alienation are a domination paradigm. And then the question to me, with the domination paradigm, it always organizes on a vertical axis because it has to do with power over, and it has to do with hierarchy and where you are on a ladder, whereas relatedness happens horizontally. And I got very curious about why we abandoned horizontality in favor of this verticality, because any above engenders the below, which is how Earth became hell. That's how the transition happened, basically, is imperially through that logic. So, I got very curious about this. But then, it's happening sort of against this backdrop of these experiences that I'm having, running this, it was, like a collective and also a neurotechnology company. And so just to come back to something that you said that I think is paradoxical a little bit, I was laughing when you were talking about fuck you money, because, I'm like, I live 50 miles from Silicon Valley. I know people who are billionaires. I also know people who are broke ass, but But I had these very interesting experiences many of them were quite ironic, I thought, while I was running this company. So, we were trying to do this work that felt very innovative. I think it's important work. We ended up setting the company up as it's oriented towards being like a public benefit corporation, but it's a for-profit structure, right? There was a question about, is it a nonprofit, is it a for-profit? Part of the reason we did it as a for-profit was because we were building neurotechnology, we were building software. It's expensive. There were capital outlays required, and I needed early stage investors. And sort of being in contact with that world, I had a number of experiences that were just profoundly ironic. We were involved with, quote unquote, conscious capitalism. I'm not going to say anybody's names here because it would be very rude. But we were involved, with a fund that was run by, a billionaire, Silicon Valley kind of person who had set up a fund to, quote unquote, transform human consciousness, right? And we were in this dialogue about them putting, ultimately it was like $8 million into the company. And I got this very front row seat on the way that domination had just infected all of these systems. I don't know how else to put it. We had this 6-month collaboration with this globally renowned leadership and executive coaching firm. And the level of mendacity displayed by the leadership of this organization that was purportedly like all about integrity and leadership, again, like it was just astonishing to me. Stanford University School of Medicine, I will call them out. They stole a body of our work. They came back and tried to steal a second body of our work. There's a book called Applied Mindfulness that you can go find, in the world, that was edited by Victor Carrion, who's he's like a vice dean of the medical school. He lifted the entire book from a curriculum we developed for Nadine Burke-Harris, and was collaborating with her. And she called him and was like, "Dude, what the fuck?" And but it's out there, right? And so we had this moment where we thought about suing the Stanford University School of Medicine. But they seem to have unlimited money. And I didn't, it was like, well, that's probably going to take a lot of time and energy. But ironic, I think, is the word, right? For a lot of these experiences. And I think, one of the beauties of a podcast, what I like about a podcast is, this like intimacy of having someone's voice in your ear. I like to listen to them while I'm driving. I like that feeling of like, you kind of feel like you get to know somebody through their voice. I love that. And, somebody whose podcast I listen to, fairly regularly is Scott Galloway, is professor of marketing, right? Prof G, right? Mm-hmm. I think I agree with, about half of what he says. But I like certain qualities of sensitivity he has. I think he's authentic in a certain way. And every once in a while, he'll say something that really like cuts through the noise. And he said this thing the other day that was some version of, if you really want to make money, if you look at the companies that have made ludicrous money, I mean, just broadly speaking, what they're typically doing is exploiting a flaw in human behavior.
Yeah.
One of, I think, the most extraordinary examples of that is Facebook, or, social media broadly construed.
In general, yeah.
I have a teenage daughter, and if I could put a bullet through her phone,
Yeah.
Because it's essentially like a crack lollipop plugged into my kid's, head. I hate that shit. So, you look at how do things get monetized. The things that have been extraordinarily successful, often they're exploiting a flaw, whether it's a cigarette company or alcohol, or, you just look at all these different ways, right? Not to say that there are not other ways to add value, but if the goal is money, most of the things are exploiting something that's a vulnerability in humans, how they're designed. And so there's something, problematic about just going directly after capital, because, I say it's ironic what happened with Stanford and what happened with, this funder and all these other things. But the reality is that if the goal is to make money, if that's the primary goal, then everything else falls away. And I think there's this bullshit that like, oh yeah, conscious capitalism, and like, oh yeah.
Yeah.
But I've had front row seats on the psychedelic movement. I've had front row seats on the mindfulness movement. I've had front row seats on a lot of this stuff. And when you get down and dirty with how this shit gets monetized, once you're in the domain of capitalism, once you're really sort of optimizing for those outcomes, once you're looking at it through that framework, decisions get made based on revenue flows. That's just how the shit works. So, the complication, right, is that. And then, just to add the other side of it, like we also worked, I spent about I don't know if it was 500, maybe 1,000 hours trying to collaborate with Extinction Rebellion.
Yeah.
The founders of that organization came to us. They asked us if they could, if we could sort of try to design a version of our software to support activists, which I was super into because I think that work is really profound and beautiful. And I became good friends with Skeena Rather, who was their head of global visioning, and we spent a lot of time thinking about this. And I think my takeaway at some level, I love the heart of what they're doing. But then we couldn't organize anything, And so for me, there's this sort of, I don't even know if it's a paradox, but when I look at capitalism and I look at, sort of nonprofits, like if you juxtapose a for-profit and nonprofit organization, this is certainly a stereotype, but I think it does bear out to some degree, which is that for-profit organizations tend to be radically immoral, but very good at getting shit done. Whereas my experience with nonprofits is they tend to be like radically heartful and terrible at execution. And, I tend to bias toward action at this point in my career, which tilts me in the direction of, efficiency.
Yeah.
But I want to do it with heart. But man, it's been really challenging to kind of walk that line with our work in terms of, viability. And I don't think I have complaints about that at this point. I think it's just observational. But, I've been astonished. I think I have been astonished by the behavior of people who purported to be in it for like the right reasons and then turned out to have extraordinarily razor sharp elbows when the shit got real.
Yeah. It sounds like everything gets kind of subsumed by the system, like everything gets swallowed by it. You could call it conscious capitalism, you could call it whatever you want. You bring in these, say psychedelics, and you take psychedelics, you take mushrooms that are, anybody can probably pick somewhere in your forest. You could probably pick these mushrooms for free. And now there's companies that are trying to take them and then create different ways of, different therapies in different ways. And then they want to create IP, right? Intellectual property. How can I protect it, right? How can I build a gate? Because that way I can profit and I can protect myself. Once again, it's like kind of building that castle, building that moat. And that's a lot of how capitalism operates. And that's how you really, like, if you want, like you said, if you want to be successful, that's kind of the lane to get that money and to be really successful and to give you the best hand of cards. But if you play with more heart and you do this kind of where you're more collaborative and capital is not the main thing, then you just kind of, the other guys kind of, the Amazons just kind of stomp all over the small guys that are trying to do things the right way. And I think the other thing that you're speaking about, and this is a huge conversation in the spaces that I move, is this notion between kind of power and wisdom, right? I think you said like effectiveness and heart. That's another way we could kind of look at it, is how do we bridge these two, right? Because you have people that are very wise, and I'm sure you've worked with a lot of them. You speak about some of these indigenous people that are so connected to the earth and so connected to themselves, so connected to their tribes, but they don't have that leverage. They don't have that necessarily that power and that influence. And then you have people that have a lot of power, a lot of influence, a lot of money, but they don't necessarily have that connection. So there's this huge conversation of how do we bring these streams together where the wise people are the ones with the power. The wise people are the ones that are able to be effective and to create cascades that are moving our society towards well-being instead of towards collapse.
I think you're speaking precisely to the center circle of the Venn diagram there. That's exactly it. I got really interested a couple of years ago. We've been working on a project that's looking at, have you ever heard of Black Mountain College?
I have heard of Black Mountain. I believe that's in North Carolina, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, because I had another guest, Jordan Hall, who he's a kind of a big figure in the spaces I move in, and he like several years ago ended up landing there, and like he ended up like converting to Christianity, but he's like a big fan of like Black Mountain. Like this is like a beautiful, very like community oriented town from what he's expressed. But yeah, go ahead. And what were you going to say about
interesting example? So there's a town, but there was also a college by that same name, Black Mountain College. It existed for about 20 years. It was very dramatically underfunded its entire history. It was tiny. I mean, tiny. It produced an extraordinary number of the most celebrated and innovative artists of the 20th century in America. And, it's punching far above its weight, right? And for me, it's a very interesting example of like, what is the recipe for creating a collective that becomes genius in the collective? Because it wasn't like they just produced a couple of people who were geniuses. They had basically a genius factory somehow. And I got very interested in like, what are the examples of this in history and what are the conditions that have to come together for that to happen? I think the Florentine Renaissance in Italy is another, probably the most famous example. Mm-hmm. I think you could make an argument that Silicon Valley at certain times has been a little bit like that. How do you incubate collective genius? And what would it mean to incubate it with the specific intent of redressing some of these fundamental issues? And I start to look at things like mycelial networks in forests, because the forest that I'm in here, for example, the primary meadow has 47 old growth Douglas fir trees in it. It's about 3 acres, but the entire meadow has this mycelial network. And it'll just, if the conditions are right, it'll shoot out a mushroom, dude, the size of like a platter. I mean, I could go grab one that's bigger than this.
Wow,
right?
Beautiful.
I got one 20 feet away. We'll throw it in the show notes, a photograph of it. So it'll just produce this efflorescence. The beautiful thing about the mycelial network is that it's basically the intelligence of the commons. It's directing resources to where they're required to maximize the health of the entire system. And, one of the things I go into in the book Ground is the early enclosure laws in England. I'm looking at the last 12,000 years and I'm sort of looking at these like key moments where we moved away from the collective and towards like, individuation or alienation. And, there was this point in England where they started passing these enclosure laws that basically took common land and then privatized it. Right? And I think you could say that the movement of capitalism is essentially to take common resources and privatize the gains. That's sort of the model, is you take something that's like a commons and then you extract from it, whether it's a mine that's extracting, we own this land, therefore we own the mineral rights, we're going to extract this thing, or whether it's a commons of ideas. And so my kind of question is like, what's the opposite of that? And mycelium is a pretty good example of like something that enriches the collective commons. And how do we start biomimicking that in terms of organizational structure? What would it look like to create collaborations and organizations that start to enrich the commons? One of, the simple ways, like I've been playing with this notion around, some of our interviews is like, when I do interviews with people, we get reciprocal rights to them, so that it enriches both sides, right? And the funny thing is that like our first attorney for my company fired herself at a certain point. We were working on these films, and I was saying to her, I want the contracts to say that the talent gets to decide whether or not they like the cut. And she's like, that's a horrible idea. You know, your job is to exploit the talent. And I'm like, but I don't want to exploit anybody. And she's like, but that's the letter of the law. Like, why are you paying these people if you're not going to, you know? And so, but my feeling was kind of like, well, wait a minute. If they are really happy with what we did, then both of us are going to do better. But again, you start to encounter like the entire legal frameworks are designed to be asymmetrical power over, you know? So you've got to cut through, like, it's not, there's all these layers of scaffolding infrastructure that are elaborated from this alienated view, right? And you can kind of track it back to like the point where if a person is in a fight or flight response, I'm getting a bit animated about this, so I'll take it down just a notch. But if a person is in a fight or flight response, one of the characteristics of that physiology is that the body is looking for who's against me and who's with me. It's looking for an us and a them at a physiological level. And our entire civilization is predicated on that notion that there's an us and there's a them. And the really interesting thing physiologically is if you're in a connection state, there is no them. It's all us, right? So it's very easy from that state for us to design win-win, you know? I don't need to exploit you. I can collaborate with you, you know? I don't need to like extract something from you. We can together create something additive that's more than either of us had. And I just think we have to reinvent the structures, the scaffolding, all the way up and all the way down. Governance, legal, organizational structure. I think that's the conversation. Because these things have to be infrastructuralized. And I think there's some interesting examples of people doing that work, attempting to do that work. I think that's sort of the next evolutionary iteration of some of this collective stuff. And it is post-capitalist, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're speaking to the notion of like decentralization, and we see this happening. You see some of that in crypto, and you mentioned mycelium network, and I love, in the neurobiology book, you really have a lot of these metaphors that connect to nature, which I think really make the ideas come alive, which I really enjoyed. But I really like this idea of mycelium network, and that we're a mycelium network. And I think there's a lot of evidence that we're like genetically very connected, very related to mushrooms.
Yeah, man.
And I've had these, experiences of like, taking magic mushrooms, taking psychedelics, and like having this realization that, like they wanted me to take them. So then it's like, then they in a sense, you merge with them, and then you're not just coming from like, you're symbiotic, you become symbiotic. And then it's like the one kind of experience that I had, it was like, actually, when I'm going to be selfish now, it's actually more painful for me to be selfish, because there's something about mycelium that it's so connective and it makes you feel everything, and that's how mushrooms are. And I feel like that's one of the experiences I had from, ingesting them, is like realizing that deep interconnectivity, and that if I want to be selfish, and that if I want to do only what's good for myself, I'm going to actually feel the suffering. And I think there's a lot of that, like being really good at disconnecting from other people's suffering, and like, wanting to like, I think there's a fear, right? When we start having these conversations with people, and there's certain people that are kind of on board with the limitations of modernity, right? And then you kind of have people that hold a more like techno-optimist kind of view, and they don't see how, they don't see all these negatives of modernity, and they don't see that there's a potential of civilizational collapse. Like that doesn't feel real for them. But I think really, if you start feeling into these things, there's a fear, right? Like there's a fear of like, let me like the snail, going back to the snail, let me go back into the shell of modernity. Let me go back into my castle with my fuck you money. Cause like coming out here, and being with everybody, there's something that I have to let go of. I have to be more vulnerable. I have to open up. I have to trust, right? I have to trust that if we're going to collaborate and we're going to create a commons and we're going to decentralize things, that I'll be good at the end of the day, right? Which is different than, having my fuck you money and having the control and being able to control everything, right? I feel like control is another aspect that's here. It's like letting go of control. It seems like that's a piece of it as well.
I strongly concord with the things you're saying. This is part of why I think it's important to really dig down to kind of the civilizational bedrock of where these narratives are being birthed. I think what we're talking about, these things are very, very potent psychologically. I don't think it's an accident that the richest white men on earth, in terms of economic prosperity, are trying to leave the planet in how shall I say this? Aspirational models of their own fully erect blah blah blah. Look at what these rockets are. I mean, look at this whole narrative. It's a masculine supremacy. I think the deep fear that undergirds that, there's this narrative about expand into the cosmos, blah, blah, blah. The irony, of course, is that as far as we can tell, this is the only biosphere in the known universe that can support biotic life. I don't think Mr. Musk is going to enjoy being on Mars very much. I think one of the things that these kind of views have in common is people radically not feeling at home here in their own bodies, in relationship, in communion and connection, right? There's something really profoundly ironic about Mark Zuckerberg designing a communications technology because he's terrible at relationships. Many of the people designing these communications technologies are autistic. There's an irony here that's really profound. The very technical underpinnings of these technologies are designed by people who are not good at relationships. It doesn't have to be that way. What does a social network look like when it's designed to enhance outcomes and value for all parties?
Yeah. So, I think one thing that kind of stands out from this dialogue that we're having is kind of it's funny, but no pun intended, but kind of starting from the ground. It does feel like there's something of that. It seems to me that a lot of change that is going to happen is going to have to start from maybe some of these smaller communities on the ground, maybe like kind of the village level, where people are coming together and finding a different way to share resources, to share ideas, to connect in that way. I'm curious I'm not sure what you talk about in the book, but if there's any, we're talking about kind of decentralization and stepping more into that kind of way of relating and being, but I'm curious if there's anything else you think, any other pathways that we can take, or maybe simple things that can start, you've already spoken about allowing your feet to kind of talk.
I'll bring it full circle for us in a way that I think you'll appreciate, and I think your listeners, will appreciate. So when I think about this second part of our conversation broadly, the thing that I think is interesting is, based on everything we're talking about in terms of, the neurobiology of connection, right? Where well-being comes from, how it's social in nature, how we have to feel safe enough in order to turn on those systems. If we want to be well, and this is true, I think, whether we think the world is getting better or worse. It almost doesn't matter whether we think it's getting better or worse. What we would do is we would create, more community of trust And it would be ideally intergenerationally. It would be intergenerational. We would have people with different skills and different backgrounds and different perspectives. I think about the sacred technology of the circle here, because if you think about the origin of humanity in deep time, and you imagine, Artem, that you and I are like part of a small band and we're out on the savannah and it's 100,000 years ago. And we have our little fireplace at night, this little village, there's 25 to 35 of us. If we're trying to kind of maximize our safety from marauding predators, we sit in a circle. Because if we sit in a circle and we're all sort of looking at the fire and then across of it, every direction is covered, right? And the beauty of it spiritually is that the person farthest from me across the circle, which is to say the person that's most different from me, is actually the person who has the clearest view of everything I cannot see. It's a radical teaching on diversity, right? And so the healthiest community has the greatest integration of diversity, because the perspective that's totally different than mine is the one that's possibly illuminating the things that are behind me that I can't see about myself, So if we think the world's getting better or worse and we want to be well, we start building these kind of networks, right? And I think it can happen, both in the interdimensional space of the internet, but it should also happen on the ground at a practical level, because if I need to borrow butter or sugar or milk, or if the power goes out or whatever, I want to have people that I can depend on. And I think orienting it towards like projects and let's do work together and let's, and to have land. And I think you can incorporate the full spectrum of planning for, there's a lot of apocalypse merchants out there, right? There's a lot of things that are pushing us in the direction of outcomes that are not good. But I think you can plan for the full range of contingencies, which is that things could get better, what might go right, and what might go wrong. In either case, having these kinds of networks fortifies us at both a neurophysiological level and then makes our lives easier. So I say, let's build that, and let's continue to explore how those things link together and how they link across virtual spaces and value chains and decentralized currency and all this stuff. But let's be conscious of building interlinking sets of circles, and let's do that on purpose. I'm gonna, this sounds so markety, but I wrote this book called Awakening Human Connection, and it's basically it was 10 simple steps to building connection with a group of other people. I wrote it basically for facilitators. We did this kind of ridiculous thing, which is we just made it available for one day, which was both kind of rude, but I was also curious, if we just let this be for 24 hours, what would happen? And I think, 100 people bought it. But, and then I pulled it down because I was like, we don't need another book. We've got lots of books on the thing. But I think what I'd like to do is let your listeners get access to that book. So we'll figure out what that means.
Oh, that's awesome.
I'll send you a link or something. And then everybody who's endured the last 2 hours of this, can have that. It's kind of like a field guide to creating human connection in a circle, because it's what we're talking about.
I love that. And I appreciate that kind offer. And, I really like the image that you're painting about the circle and everybody sitting around the fire, and that being the safest way for people to gather, because we can see each other's backs. And then the person who's furthest away from you, who, has the most different opinion, is actually the one that can see behind you. And, this topic of unity and diversity has come up in a previous podcast that I haven't yet released, but we were also talking about this, having unity and diversity, and how having, allowing there to be difference is important, and being able to speak across difference is important. I was thinking about, there's this practice I do called circling, and it's really weird because the people that kind of created it, they try to create an intellectual property around it, and not necessarily for negative reasons. They wanted to basically be hey, we want to have a standard of quality for people who facilitate this practice.
Sure.
And it ended up not working out because there was already other organizations that were doing it, and they just started calling it different things. So there's one organization that calls it transformational connection. There's another organization that calls it relatefulness. But I think that in general, and I still call it circling because that's kind of like when I was introduced to it, that's how I was introduced to it, and that kind of sticks. That name stuck to me. But it's really this practice of relating and relationality of how, normally when we're having a conversation, we're talking about something else, right? It's you, me, and we're talking about something else. But circling really brings it like, what is the connection between us here right now? What's happening right here, right now? And I found this practice to be so transformational in my life. And it's something that I've been training in. And I'm currently in a program. It's like a 9-month that I'm training more to go deeper because you could go so deep into practice. I feel like even though I've been doing it for years, I still feel like I've only scratched the surface with it. But yeah, hearing you talk about that, it's like, I think about this practice and like this being a psychotechnology of a way of helping people love one another, because there's so many different people that come on and do this practice. And I've learned that I'm like, wow, when people really show up in this kind of vulnerable way, when we're just trying to really be open-minded and open-hearted with each other, like there's so many different people with different opinions and different ways of seeing the world, but I could actually love all of them. Like I actually can love all of them. And so like having these kind of practices and these ways of relating, and also there's this idea of creating like a network of nodes of different communities, which, every community is like its own thing, where you have like 150 to 200 members, which really kind of tracks with this notion of tribes and how we've kind of learned, to move around and hunter gatherer kind of 150, 200 member things. But then also like all of these networks, all of these 150, 200 person communities being in conversation with others and kind of creating and tapping into wisdom in this way. So to me, these kind of ideas connect to this metaphor that you've created of that you've mentioned of the circle and sitting around the fire.
I have a colleague and friend who's in Portland area named Carrie Munn, Munn, who I think you might enjoy interviewing for this podcast on some of these themes. She's an ecosystem architect, and she's quite brilliant. And she works in the design and development of these kinds of living networks. And it's quite artful what she does.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. I'm always looking for recommendations, so I will definitely look into her. And yeah, I've really, really appreciated this conversation, and I like how it felt like it was like two parts. Like we first kind of tackled some of the stuff in the neurobiology of connection and spoke about polyvagal theory and the autonomics model and kind of some things you've added. We've also kind of explored health and disease and spoke about different practices and pathways for rebalancing dysregulated nervous systems. And then, of course, we kind of just went off on a tangent here of addressing kind of the limitations of modernity and some of the stuff that you talk about in your new book, Ground. But I'm curious, is there anything else you want to speak to or touch on before we wrap up this conversation today?
Well, I just want to note it went a little different when I put on the leather jacket, bro.
Yeah. Yeah. It was different energy, different energy, man.
I've really enjoyed our conversation. I appreciate the flow of it and the quality of your questions, and it's felt alive and aligned. And I hope it's really useful to your audience. Our work is at hearthscience.io. That's the primary website for our stuff. Our kind of storefront is restorative and then I have a website under the name I write under, which is Natureza Gabriel.com, I guess. And we run an autonomics clinic as well. So I do a lot of research at this point in my career. I teach a lot. I train people all over the world in these tools and technologies. And I work clinically with people on autonomic physiology, and autonomics.health is the clinical site. Mm-hmm. So if people are interested, if you want to go full bore into the stuff, as our TEM has done, I would say the Neurobiology of Connection is a great place to start. If you wanted to just be introduced in a simpler way to some of the core concepts we talked about today, I wrote a book called Finding Home in Your Nervous System. And that's a good primer in many of the things we discussed.
Yeah, beautiful. Yeah, I think something you mentioned that I wanted to reflect back was cool, was that this is the connection system. Really, this is the social, like coming from the connection system, and then you wrote ground, which is coming from the grounding system. So then I'm curious, is the third book in the trilogy is going to be something about movement?
It's called Body as Verb, and we've started.
Okay, and that makes sense.
Already. Yeah, it's the genius of the vertebrate movement system is the provisional title right now.
Beautiful. So, yeah. Well, I think your books are phenomenal, and I have the other one, Restorative Practices, and actually I've had that book, and I'm trying to. I work with my wife. We have a psychotherapy practice with like 25 clinicians, and that book, I'm like, oh, this is such a great book to have like in the waiting room.
Yes.
So I'm meaning to get that book there. I think it really tracks.
Totally.
And putting it over there in the waiting room, having it there. But yeah, really appreciate your work, and I'm looking forward to reading some of these new books. And yeah, Gabriel, thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks for your time, Artem.